I'd be like, hey, I just moved the micro test to Friday. People would be like, what? That's what I did. Because if you stand up here and go, can I get a show of hands who'd like to move the micro test to Friday? It's always going to be 50-50. And now you're ticking people off. It's easier, just tick them up, just be an NCO. Forget it. It's not a choice. But you handle class however you want. People don't agree. And having said all of that, for the people that are like me, once I get the schedule back then, when I was in PA school, I can plan around. I've already planned out. I'm a planner. I don't want you to move anything. So I'm the one that doesn't want you to move anything. I don't care if it benefits half the class or not. It may benefit me, but I already know that test is mine. My mind's already set. See, there's different mentalities. I had to say that to those people in the room too. Never want to move anything. But most time it benefits you if you move it. I'm like some of y'all, I don't like moving. Wait, nervous tissue provides, I do it all the time now with my class. Nervous tissue is different than muscle in regards to, now we're talking about how does the neuron cell look, but it's going to just change some of the names on it. So we're going to have a cell again that doesn't look like a typical cell. But when we talk about nervous tissue is specifically able to generate action potentials. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at these action potentials and how they work. Right? And I mentioned once again, we know that the nervous system sends electrical potentials, the endocrine system uses hormones, and both of those control homeostasis in the body. We can't talk about nervous without backing up a little bit and saying, okay, let's make sure that we know that the brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system. Everything outside of that is the peripheral nervous system. That's going to include the infamous cranial nerves, all of your different peripheral nerves, and then you're going to have spinal nerves. Okay? An easier way to think of that as we go through neuro is just to say, the brain and spinal cord are your central nervous system. Once you get outside of that at all, because the spinal nerves where you're going to have things leave first. Spinal nerves and cranial nerves will come off of that. As soon as it leaves the spinal cord, it's the peripheral nervous system. Okay. I'll mention that again later, but that's an easier way to think of it. And we break down our nervous system into three different components. When we talk about, well, there's a sensory side, and then there's an integrative side, and then there's motor. So we need to pick up that sensory from the periphery, wherever it's coming from, send it back to the central nervous system, and then send out a motor response. So all of our sensors are out there detecting this hot, cold. In the autonomic side, you could say chemical composition of blood. There's some sensors for everything. So sensory carries it from generally the peripheral nervous system back to the central nervous system. Those are called afferent neurons. Neurons that travel back towards the central nervous system are sensory neurons, and they're afferent neurons. Inside the brain, we have a bunch of neurons that talk to neurons. So they're integrative neurons. They make the decisions for everybody. And then the motor responds to that. We're going to send a signal from the brain or spinal cord, or we can say the brain stem itself. We're going to send that out to the peripheral nervous system, to wherever that sensory was. We're going to give a motor response, and that's an efferent neuron. Okay, we're sending nervous impulses or motor responses back to the effectors using efferent neurons. We also break down the nervous system once again into our somatic, autonomic, and enteric. Right? Somatic. There are some outliers, right? We generally think of somatic as things that we have control over. We can also kind of link, anytime somebody says somatic, think skeletal muscle. Because we all know that we voluntarily control our skeletal muscle. So we're in control of a lot of the somatic nervous system. Not all of it. Not all of it fits what I just said, because when you look at the body wall, the head, the limbs, all the sensation coming from out here is called somatic sensations. But you also have some of your special senses included in there. hearing, right? Our balance, smell. We'll get to those in the next test, but those are special senses. So there's a big difference, and I'll repeat this more and more, between saying what's a general sense versus a special sense. Well, we spend a whole blocks on special senses, a whole test block. Right? General senses are like touch, itch, tickle, feel. When you get to sight, smell, those are special senses, and they're a little different. Okay. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, that's going to control things like our viscera, our heart, our lungs. I know all y'all know most of this. But, smooth muscle glands, the bowels, all of that, we're not in control of that for the most part. And then the enteric nervous system. So I always mention it, especially when I first started learning this, is that the enteric nervous system, a long time before I even started, but I don't know why they don't just change it up and put it up as the autonomic nervous system. The enteric nervous system functions the same as the autonomic nervous system, except it's only talking control of the GI tract. And it used to be the thinking that, like the bowels, GI tract, did not, or was not controlled by the central nervous system, that it regulated itself. Enteric nervous system, right? It's inside of itself is regulating it. But now we know, and so all your muscles, smooth muscles, glands in the bowels, it's under involuntary control, but we know now that it does connect back to the central nervous system. So if we break down this chart, here's our central nervous system. We have our somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous, and enteric nervous. So they used to think that this connection didn't exist. Right? That the brain wasn't receiving. The enteric nervous system was like that kid on Sesame Street that's doing its own thing. If you watch one of these kids doing it, anyway. But that's not true. So I'm like, well, it's really just like the autonomic nervous system anyway. Another key thing is under the, and we're going to spend time on this too, the autonomic nervous system. In red and blue here, blue is representing sensory, red is representing our motor control. Under the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic system that fall under the motor side of it. And that's a big system that we'll need to talk about later, but that's where they fall. Alright, I don't need to put these at the end of the block. These are something we need to know before we start talking about neurons, different terms. If you say a nerve is a bundle of neuronal axons in the peripheral nervous system. We're going to get to what peripheral and all that is, but if you think of the nerve that leaves your central nervous system and goes to your bicep, when you look at a neuron, right, just in case you don't know, you have a neuron has a cell body generally, and then there's different types of neurons, so I'm just drawing the most common type. It has all these dendrites out here that would be out there picking up signals, and then it has an axon that can be short or very long, and then it has synaptic end bulbs or whatever out here. So what we're saying is this is the axon. So a collection of neuronal axons in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. A ganglion is a collection of neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So that's these cell bodies here. So in certain areas outside of the central nervous system, out further away from it, you have collections of neuron cell bodies, and they're called ganglion. These are just defined, and then we'll talk about where they're at. A plexus is just an extensive network of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Plexus can also be like Venus. Like you have plexus and veins in your legs and stuff. But we're talking about nerves. And you have to compare those, because what they did is they changed it on you. If you're in the central nervous system, so maybe it's better if you put up here, I underlined it on the slide twice there. Peripheral nervous system. Collection of neuronal axons, nerve. Collection of neuronal cell bodies, a ganglion. But in the central nervous system, we're going to call them something different. A collection or an association of neuronal axons in the central nervous system is not called a nerve, it's called a tract. So this is CNS. When you talk about a collection of neuronal cell bodies in the central nervous system, it's called the nucleus. So peripheral, you have a nerve. Central, you have a tract. Peripheral, you have the ganglion. Central, you have a nucleus. Right? They're both cell bodies and axons, but they're just called something different. Which of the following is the most common type of skin cancer? Basal cell. Now, we don't have clickers anymore, and I used to have people take this and they would answer oat cell carcinoma, which tells me they just pick one. Because we have not, I'm giving another test taking technique with every class, and it's hard for you to remember because you have so many different classes, but if you're reading that online, you're like, what the hell's oat cell carcinoma? I've never heard of that. Don't answer the damn thing. Don't answer that. It's every answer on my test are real. It may be a good distractor, but if you definitely go, I've never heard of that. Probably not the answer. Now you could have been sleeping during the time we talked about it, but a lot of times your brain knows. I've never heard of that. We're not going to talk about oat cell carcinoma never in here, so we'll leave that for respiratory and different places. Okay, histology of tissues, of nerves. So we have neurons, we said, are excitable. They have the property of electrical excitability, so they can transmit these all-important action potentials. And then we have neuroglia. There are neurons, and there are a bunch of different types of neuroglia. Neuroglia are the support cells of the nervous system. So there are a lot more neuroglia than there are neurons. And actually, if you lose neurons, they don't come back. If you huff paint and you kill neurons in your central nervous system, they ain't coming back. They don't regenerate. Peripheral nerves can kind of repair themselves, but central, like I said, once you kill them, they're gone. But they'll just make more neuroglia in that area too, but we'll get to that later. Okay, let's go through this cell. Okay, I know where we're going to. I'll give you a few minutes at the end of it. Let's just look at the structure of a neuron, and then we'll quit for the day. Okay, that encompasses a couple of slides. So it doesn't look like a generalized cell. It kind of does up here, though, right? So the neuron has some special processes. So that's the cell body, and then you have dendrites out here, and then you have that axon. Right? Now the people who came up with all the names knew that in 2024 we were going to be sitting here, and they said, listen, we did all the work, we got to make it hard on them. We can't name everything the same. That's what I think happened. They said, okay, well, we tricked them a little bit, because remember we did plasmolema in a muscle cell. We said, hey, let's call it a sarcolemma. That's what they did in the neuron. They said, let's call it a axolema. There is a neurolema, but let's call it an axolema. And instead of cytoplasm, let's call it axoplasm. I get it, it's so you can tell what you're talking about, but I don't know if we had to change the name. I think we would have figured that out. I think they did it just to mess with us. They had foresight to mess with PA class 24. But there's a different name for it. Alright, that's all there is to it. Nothing new there, though. Neurons have all the typical players that we find in cells, typical organelles. You have your cytoplasm, your lysosomes, your mitochondria. There's a difference, though, with the rough ER in a neuron, it's broken up. So if you look really closely, I'll draw more on here, you'll see a bunch of gray-looking dots in a neuron. Those are the rough ER. They call them Niesel bodies. But Niesel bodies are what they call prominent clusters of rough ERs. So it's kind of all over the place. So remember, the rough ER before was right up against our nuclear envelope. Dendrites is a word meaning little trees, and those are the receiving end. Right? When you have an axon, the axon is what's going to be responsible for sending the impulse down the length of that axon, which is called propagation. So propagating down. We'll talk about how that is later, but and they can be very long. It says 3 feet long in humans. That's a pretty long nerve. Talk about things like the vagus nerve. It's very long. Generally, you only have one axon that comes off of one neuron cell body. And it's going to arise from an area that's called the axon hillock. Right? So as it starts to come off of there. And then the first part of that, they're all kind of close together. I'm going to draw a line here. There's going to be a point, and it's called the initial segment. And at the initial segment is where we find our trigger zone in a lot of neurons. Not all of them, but a lot. So you have the axon hillock, the initial segment, and in 2 different types of neurons, it'll be the trigger zone. The trigger zone in a neuron can vary where it's at, but the trigger zone is where an action potential is going to start. We got to start somewhere. I'm saying some of this and not explaining it yet because we're going to get to it next week. But I just want to get through the part. I'm going to throw this thing in the trash and make them find a new one. Okay, axon collaterals. Every now and then, I'm not going to give you examples, but most of the time you don't see collaterals. Sometimes you do. Like in the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to see some collaterals. Collaterals are where an axon comes off of another axon. Right? There's on collaterals. Oh, I hit the slides. Why did I get so far ahead? You have mitochondria, microtubules. That was the pen. I waved it by the screen. That was weird. Okay. Or maybe it's timed or something. What the hell is going on? Okay. Stay. Axon collaterals can come off here, but when you get to the end of that axon, you're going to have these branchings. Those are called telodendria. At the end of the telodendria is where we find synaptic embulbs. My fingertips in my example, right? Those are synaptic embulbs. Every now and then, we have, you don't really need to pick up on it. I don't care that you know this. I'm just going to tell you, sometimes you have synaptic embulbs that are in a line, like a line of swollen bumps, almost like a picture of a jellyfish dragging behind, right? I put it on there. We don't really need another thing. I want you to always kind of think of it as synaptic embulbs off of the telodendria. Inside of a neuron, we have neurofibrils, which are just intermediate filaments. So they changed the name on us again, but they're called neurofibrils, and they provide shape for this neuron and how it's set up. You also have microtubules, but microtubules, while we use them in like somatic cells to help pull DNA and things apart in the spindles or move things around within a cell, that's how they're used more in a neuron. In a neuron, you're going to have microtubules that run the length of the axon. They're like train tracks, right? And you can use them to move things back and forth between the cell body and the axon. Because most of the stuff that goes on in a cell in a neuron is happening here. And what if we need it down here? It's going to use microtubules and things to move it. Okay. Actually, I'm going to cover these 2 slides and we'll be done because that finishes the thought. The axon terminals are where we reach our telodendria. Only contain some cytosol, some mitochondria, maybe a little bit of cytoskeleton holding it together, but a large part of it's synaptic vesicles. We need to release those vesicles. All the synthesis of proteins, like if we want to put more proteins down there in the synaptic embulb area, the telodendria, it's going to have to come from the cell body. So we're going to have to transport them down there. Even cytoplasm has to be transported from the cell body down into the axon. They do this 2 ways. You have slow axonal transport, which is pretty much transmitting axoplasm into a growing or regenerating axon. Now don't get confused that I just said axons or neurons are not replaced. We'll get to that next week, but central nervous system neurons, if they die, are dead. In the peripheral nervous system, you have the ability to regenerate axons. I'm going to leave that for next week because it requires things like you got to have an intact cell body, it's got to have Schwann cells, stuff we don't need to get into yet because you don't want to go to that. I will get back to that though. So at some point, sometimes you're going to need to transmit more cell membrane, axoplasm, that kind of stuff. So they would use slow. I think of it like honey rolling down through the axon. Cytoplasm, axoplasm moving down. But if you need to move things like neurotransmitters, okay, you're going to use microtubules, these tracks or these motors, and it can actually go both ways. You can move things from the synaptic end bulbs back to the cell body, or from the cell body to the synaptic end bulbs. You're using fast axonal transport, and that's just the way we get new parts of the membrane, stuff that we need to release, like acetylcholine, out of those synaptic end bulbs. So next week, I will try to recap the first part of this neuro. This is going to be, I don't even think I come back in until Wednesday or something. So y'all forgot I even exist. So we'll kind of, I'll retouch this for a few minutes and then we'll go into the rest of it, right? So I probably should have stopped before we started because y'all got micro on your mind. Try it. Try it. Be happy. Y'all are here till like 5 or something. Should still be happy. Alright, I shouldn't have said that last part. Y'all have a great day, have a great weekend. He said, tell somebody that's supporting you that you appreciate it because you don't realize it, you're probably being a jerk. See you later.